Okay, welcome everyone. I am excited for this presentation today. This is our presentation in track 1 for Joanna Holmes, titled SpAACes What is Happening When AAC Isn't or Appears Not to Be. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joanna Holmes. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, good evening, everybody. So like Jackie said, my name is Joanna Holmes, and I will tell you a little bit about myself. First of all, I just want to explain a little bit about the background I've got going on and what I'm wearing. So where I am right now, it's 10 o'clock at night. And this is a t-shirt that I bought about 12, 13 years ago when I was at City Park watching the Mets in New York. So I thought I would make my pajamas match the background of what I had going on here. I couldn't bear to not get into my pajamas at 10 o'clock at night, even if I'm doing a presentation. Like I said, my name's Joanna Holmes. I am currently a full-time parent carer for my daughter Lucy, who has Emmanuel syndrome, which is a rare genetic condition which causes learning disabilities, physical disabilities, complex communication needs, lots and lots of stuff going on for Lucy. So that's my main job, if you like, at the minute. But in my former life, I was a speech and language therapist. I was a speech and language therapist for about 19 years until I eventually decided that I just needed to focus on being a parent carer back in 2021. And having both those hats, I have reflected a lot and done a lot of thinking about things, and decided to share some of that through some social media, a bit of a blog, and just taking opportunities really to share my experience. A lot of the presentations that I do tend to come from a bit of a sense of discomfort, really. I was reflecting on this. I did a presentation yesterday as well, and a lot of the themes that I find I'm talking about have come from me feeling a little bit kind of awkward or uncomfortable about something in particular. So really, I think what the main focus of my my presentations is a bit of free therapy for me. Now, one of the things that I have reflected a lot on being spending quite a lot of time now in AAC spaces. I did work for a little while with adults with profound and multiple learning disabilities, and AAC was a big part of that role. But prior to that, I worked with people who stammer, so that's people who stutter, and clutter and any kind of fluency things going on. And within that field, I think the speech and language therapy profession has been quite open about learning from other areas and sort of building other types of therapy into speech and language therapy practice. So I was trained in cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness and various of those kinds of support. So I think whenever I think about anything, I bring quite a psychological kind of feel to that. And I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is probably reflective of that in terms of myself, and that's why I'm having these reflections. I am just a little bit curious who is watching this. I'm not going to say afternoon, tonight. Who's watching tonight? We've got parents, teachers, speech and language therapists, other professionals. I just want to get a bit of a feel for who's out there. I have Slack open here, but I'm aware that I might just need to wait a little minute just for it to catch up. So I'm just looking out for what kind of roles people who are listening have got in terms of AAC. A grandma. I didn't say grandma. Cool. Oh, that is really cool, actually, because I'm going to talk a little bit about grandparents and wider family and things. So yeah, that is cool. It's so funny. I can just see somebody's typing. So I'm waiting. Okay, an SLP. Just for point of clarity, I will say SLT because it's pretty ingrained in me. Because over here in the UK, they're called speech and language therapists. So we've got one grandma, one SLP. Don't know whether we've got any other people listening just at the moment. Another SLP. Okay. And okay, adult part-time AAC user. Okay. Oh, hi, I'm in that group. Okay, mum and SLP grad students, so somebody else with a couple of hats. That's cool. Okay. All right, so a bit of a range of people. I will keep popping my eyes down on that and see if I get any other replies. But in the meantime, another parent, cool. Oh, I think we might have met before. We may recognize your name. Okay. So I'm just going to make that a little bit bigger, I think, on my screen so I can see it a bit better. Right, great. So there are links to references that I've used and information that I'm talking about here in the it's actually a Wakelet page, but there's a bit.ly link and a QR code if you want to scan that. I'll show it up at the end as well. It's my lazy way of referencing. I'm not doing like full-on Harvard referencing at the end on a slide. It's just, it's all in there, and if you want it, you can get straight to it. Okay. So my goal really today is, okay, another parent. Cool. Lots of parents, that's good to know. What I want to do is have a think about how we talk about the times when AAC doesn't happen. I'm calling them the SpAACes. I've welcomed seeing a few posts recently on social media that actively promoting meeting families where they're at. But I really want to invite everybody who's in this space and listening and watching to have a think even more deeply about what's happening in those spaces. I think it goes a little bit beyond kind of letting off parents or saying, oh, it's okay, you don't have to do it right now, but eventually we're going to fill all the spaces with AAC, to actually thinking about what are all the things that happen in the family of a child with complex communication needs for any reasons, and how they're contributing to the big picture of that child's development and belonging and all kinds of things. It's also a bit of a feeling of that I feel like I'm connecting dots a little bit. I feel like I'm hearing similar messages from different places, not just within AAC, but from the broader things that I read and I'm interested in. And I just want to take a minute to have a think about some of that. So what I hope is that I'll be able to show parents all the things that they're doing already to support communication that doesn't include formal AAC, and that time that's symbol or sign free or device free is not just okay if you can't manage it, but actually it's probably critical to your own and your family's well-being. Okay. So my first discomfort came here. I've talked about lots of what I write and what I'm reflecting on is kind of a function of me sitting and feeling uncomfortable with what I see. And this oft used quote really, really makes me feel uncomfortable. So if you haven't heard it before, I'll just read it out. So by 18 months, babies have heard 4,380 hours of spoken language, and we don't expect them to be fluent speakers yet. If AAC learners only see symbols modelled for communication twice weekly for 20 to 30 minutes, it will take 84 years for them to have the same exposure to aided language as an 18-month-old has to spoken language. I've always felt uncomfortable about this quote. And I know that there are a lot of people who don't. I've spoken about this before on social media, and some parents have replied that actually it was a really big motivator for me. But by the time you've heard this quote as a parent, quite often your child is already 18 months old. You've been doing all kinds of other things, and you haven't got 84 years. I'll be 111 in 84 years. And there is no way that I can, through AAC, make up that time. But I don't need to. I just want to reflect a little bit on what Lucy had by 18 months old. So she'd had 15 nights in hospital, including 3 emergency admissions. She'd had, and this is from the records that I've got of everything, at least 14 outpatient appointments with 5 different medical specialisms, medical or surgical specialisms. That doesn't include therapies, play workers, health visitors, specialist nursing. That's just the ones that were appointments with in a clinic with a medical professional who then wrote as a letter, because that's how I've calculated that. She also had 8 chest infections treated by antibiotics. Now, if you think about how a chest infection that needs antibiotics can knock you out, and within that first 18 months of life, and in fact, mostly within the first 12 months of life, Lucy had had 8. For those SLPs in the room, SLTs, needless to say, eventually we did look at what was happening in terms of aspiration, and there was something. But she also had countless snuggles, books aplenty, and family and friends. So we weren't modelling AAC at all in Lucy's first 18 months, but she was getting all of this. This was language exposure, and it is communication development. So I feel like the way that quote is used to shock people into modelling creates a bit of a false impression. And I know it's the initial emphasis was to emphasise the importance of support outside the therapy room. But what worries me is that quotes like that, if they're not diligently used and in the right places, and actually that graphic there has been shared widely on social media, that we're building guilt. And we're setting up, just from what seems like an innocuous, encouraging message, actually, we're building guilt in parents and placing an unrealistic expectation for the amount of modelling that's possible in what's already a massively time-pressured context. And also, what is happening, if AAC modelling isn't, is all part of what children need in order to learn and to thrive. And I believe, and my experience tells me, that it's impossible, even with the best will in the world, to model all the time that you would use spoken language. You can do it a lot of the time, but I think we need to, as parents, just release that pressure a little bit. And I do think sometimes the speech and language therapy profession, which I love, it feels like the goals are around sort of infiltrating every moment of the day and gradually moving from, oh, well, it's okay to do a little bit just to begin with, but eventually it's going to be happening all the time. And I think that's really difficult. And I think it's especially difficult where, like in Lucy's case, where significant learning disability is also part of what's going on. Okay. So I thought I would do some research. So I had a theory, and my theory was that advice targeted at parents that parents will be picking up online was, while often really good and really inspiring and evidence-based in terms of intervention research, probably didn't really acknowledge the needs of families. And so I did a Google search. I searched AAC advice for parents. And I looked through 17 different pages when I searched that. And the reason I did this was because there is lots of evidence, and I haven't put that slide in, but I do have that slide elsewhere, and I can share some of that research if you like, but there's lots of evidence, and I don't think I'm preaching to, I think I'm preaching to the choir maybe here. There's lots of evidence that families whose children need AAC don't get access to support. A lot of the time they're doing it themselves, or if they have got support from schools or other therapists, I think a lot of the therapists who are listening would acknowledge that maybe their service delivery models don't allow them to do everything that they would want to. And I also think it's 2023, so naturally parents are going to turn to the internet for their information. So from these 17 articles, model language and always available came up 7 times. So I've done it as a word cloud. So the biggest words are the ones that came up the most, and then it's down to the smallest words, which are things that only came up once, which were things like start small, only came up once. Get training only came up once. Support groups and articles that acknowledge the challenges of day-to-day life with a disabled child only came up twice. So that sort of reflects what I suspected. And it also reflects what I notice with the kind of posts that I make on social media. So when I write something that's a bit controversial, or it's about how something's difficult, it doesn't get as much traction as if I just put something up there that says, start early. That gets shared, it gets commented on, it gets loads and loads of likes. But the more nuanced stuff doesn't always get the same traction. I really loved listening, it was actually this morning, but Sarah Ware's presentation earlier in the conference, where she was talking about how, as part of her routine practice and looking at building community partnerships, she asked parents questions about what some of the struggles were. And I really appreciated that. So at home, we strive to use AAC as much as possible, but I don't model all the time. AAC isn't always available. But lately, I've been thinking about what is it that happens in the spaces in between and alongside the AAC support that we are doing. Okay. So, first of all, I just want to talk about the spaces for everything else. I love this graphic. This is from the blogger whose blog is called The Send World According to Me. SEND is it's not even a British term, I think it's a very English term that stands for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, and it's a term that's used quite a lot in education in particular, from the Department of Education. And she does some wonderful work. She's a great blogger and advocate, and now training as a counsellor and looking at mental health support for parents. But this graphic, this parent with, I was going to say 8 arms, but she's actually got 10, because I've just realised that there's the 2 holding the wheelchair. Just shows the number of just practical things that have got to get done. So there's cooking, there's answering the phone, there's how to do physio, there's family. There's the fact that in any given moment, this is a hoist system at the top of the image. Your hands are full. If I'm getting Lucy out of bed, my hands are full because of the physical support she needs to move around. Yeah, and we've got meds and various other things and dealing with correspondence. And I put a link in the wakelet to a story I did on Instagram, just of a yeah, it is, we really do need 10 arms, don't we, Rose? I've done a story on Instagram that I managed to do that thing where you save the story and then it's there all the time. And Lucy and I had a day out at a sporting event. We went to watch the rugby league, and I just went through everything that we'd had to do that day and some of the challenges and some of the things that, even though it was an accessible venue, and it had like a changing places, which is one of those like a specialist toilet with a bench and a hoist and all that kind of thing. But that was like a 5-minute walk from where we were sitting in the stadium, and just some of the day-to-day challenges. So that might be of interest to have a look at. You also get to have a look at a little video of Lucy. So the fact that at any given time we're not doing AAC or buying into AAC doesn't mean it's abandoned. And I've seen that terminology used in this conference. I've seen it in the literature, AAC abandonment. And there's this idea that when that happens, that families aren't bought in. And I think for a lot of families, it just means that now's not the time, and that the balance isn't quite right for AAC being the thing that you're going to implement. I'm not going to spend as much time on this idea, because I think the practical side of things is maybe the easiest thing to grasp. So I want to move on to, I've recently changed the order of these slides and I'm now wondering whether I'm regretting that. So if this is a bit clunky, I'll hopefully repair it later. So I wanted to share the outcomes of some research that was done by a wonderful woman called Joanna Griffin. She's also got a great name. She's working over here in the UK, and I've actually got her book somewhere that I can show you, I think. She's written this wonderful book called Day by Day, Emotional Wellbeing in Parents of Disabled Children. I think you can get it off Amazon anywhere in the world. She's also, she's a researcher, she's a parent herself of a child with learning disabilities and autism, and a clinical psychologist. So she's done lots of work around this. And I asked her if she had like some seminal works that I could look at. And she sent me a reference to this piece of research, and she said, oh, there's lots of seminal works in the introduction. But actually I thought, actually, I'm going to share this paper. So she did qualitative research, which means asking questions and finding out parents' own stories around things, looking at parent well-being and what that looked like. And the reason I'm putting this out here as it is because she linked it beautifully in her article, from the introduction and the description of the literature that's out there through to actually drawing conclusions that concurs with what's already out there. But she talks about 3 kind of themes that parents talked about that were important for their well-being. Coping strategies. So parents talked about having coping strategies like psychological strategies, and in that they included things like mindfulness. They also talked about just crying and venting and getting angry sometimes. They also talked about having to withdraw, and that sometimes the only thing that would help was just to like get under a blanket and have some chocolate and just get away from everything, because at that time that's what they needed to be able to cope. They said that focusing on the here and now was really important, and I often think about that when I think about conversations that I see and advice that I see a lot in the AAC field, about when parents say, but I understand what he needs, that the conversation goes, well, what about other people and what about in the future? And actually maybe that doesn't quite honour the fact that parents, in order to cope, are focusing on the here and now. this was really interesting and also backed up by other research, that one of the coping strategies that parents discussed was downplaying the diagnosis, particularly in the early years. So while we started AAC really early with Lucy, because it was kind of an easy buy-in for me. I'm a speech and language therapist. I was like, right, what's the best speech and language therapy evidence for what we're going to do? I can recognize that I also had moments of downplaying diagnosis, kind of saying to myself, well, you know, the kids with Emmanuel syndrome, they've got quite severe learning disabilities, but I'm going to work really hard with Lucy, and maybe she's not going to have such severe learning disabilities. And that was part of a coping strategy. So it's not denial, it's not lack of acceptance. It's a coping strategy that parents need in the early years. She also talked about well-being strategies, and that an important part of that was meaning and having a purposeful life journey. So people found that shared norms were helpful and gave an example of the neurodiversity movement and being connected with that. I've certainly found being part of the AAC community really helpful in terms of those shared norms and shared expectations. They also talked about picking and choosing battles. So again, this made me think, well, actually, if AAC is something that people are trying to put on a family's plate because it's part of their IEP goals or whatever, then actually that might just be a battle or a new thing that they're just choosing not to take on, whether that's consciously or not. And that also connecting with their child and taking their perspective was a really important part of their well-being strategy. And I wonder, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit further through the presentation as well, whether maybe speech and language therapists and communication professionals could spend a little bit more time thinking about those observation skills and helping parents to really understand their child's perspective and their behaviours and how they're communicating exactly as they are, and that maybe that is a foundation that's absolutely critical to them being able to build some AAC skills. I know Lucy and I spent a lot of time in her early years doing what at the time I was calling intensive interaction principles, but it really was just connecting. Parents also found that their well-being, reorienting and finding balance was really critical. So they found that they needed to change perspective, control their responses to things, that things changed across the lifespan. So the articles actually called different things at different times, that at different times parents needed different things, and sometimes it might be something taken off their plate. It might be somebody saying, actually, I know this AAC modelling is just like exhausting at the minute. How about we work on getting it embedded in school? Maybe you could send us some pictures of what you've done at the weekend, and then we can talk about those. So giving parents a role that actually feels doable and that isn't another new thing to take on if that's not where they are in life at that moment. They also talked about reorienting and finding balance in terms of accepting and adjusting expectations. I think quite often, I know my experience was in the early years, lots of people telling us how disabled Lucy was going to be and what were the things that she wasn't going to be able to do. And I was angry about that and it was upsetting, but maybe they didn't deal with it well. That's another presentation, but they weren't wrong. And one of the things that we have come to do is accept Lucy exactly how she is, whether she's using AAC or not, whether her language is having a massive development burst or not. Okay. Move on to the next slide, because I also just recently found another lovely study by a specialist teacher, and she was looking at families who'd stopped using AAC. And she said, this is Lauren Doak, she's on Twitter. She said the findings suggested that communication has a strong affective and relationship building dimension for families, and that parents can experience a range of competing emotions, including self-blame and guilt when reflecting on their child's communication. That's really powerful. And guilt and shame are close companions. And I really think we need to be incredibly conscious of whether the things that we are asking families to do are building and increasing their guilt about whether they're getting things right for their children, and really building on what are they already doing really well. Okay, I feel like I've spent quite a lot of time on things. I always run out of time. Okay. So I was going to ask a question, but I think at this point I'm probably just going to plod on. So I think we need to create spaces. So as clinicians, we need to give parents permission to create spaces, and as families, we need to allow ourselves permission to create spaces in order to build safety. I have noticed that I have lots and lots of really enjoyable times without AAC. Here's a picture of one of them. This is the first picture. Is this the first picture of Lucy? Oh, no, I think you've got one early on, but we were just sat on the sofa. Probably, if I know Lucy, got Encanto on the television, and we're just having hugs and cuddles. There's no AAC here. If I had a hand free, which I've probably not, if I'm holding Lucy on my knee on the sofa, do a bit of sign, but I don't have enough hands for a communication board. She accesses her communication through head tracking, so when she's in that position, it's not easy. But we are both relaxed. I find I'm less task focused. I can be more responsive in many ways. Lucy is responsive and calm. We are both well regulated. And lots has been written about regulation. I don't know whether those of you who are parents, and certainly those of you who are SLPs, might have heard of things like the zones of regulation, which they do use in Lucy's school. But personally, I have found the work of Mona Delahouque, who is a clinical psychologist, much more accessible to me as a parent. So she has books that are available on Amazon for like £12-13, whereas the zones of regulation book and information about that, if I'm not getting that from school always, that's like a £60 book, and then you have to sign up for courses. And I think as a parent, I sometimes go for what's affordable and usable. But I really enjoyed her work. And one of the things she talks about a lot is that actually both people in a partnership need to be regulated. And Zoe, who spoke earlier about special schools, working in a busy special school, she talked about the importance of staff regulation, and that they build in some like time for everybody just to be calm and regulated. I loved hearing that. I thought that was great. I want to just tell you a little bit of an example. So I was just talking to Jackie before the session. Jackie lives in Arizona, and I was like, so how warm is it? She was like, oh, it's about 100 degrees. My goodness. So I'm from the north of England, and it doesn't often get that hot. But last week, it's been really, really hot. And now I feel really like soft about the heat, because the temperatures were up to 30 degrees, which is 86 Fahrenheit, which compared to what Arizona is coping with is nothing. But because of that, we hadn't slept well. I hadn't slept well. Lucy hadn't slept well. At school's quite warm anyway, so she was tired. She'd been busy at school. And it also made me think of a quote from Ted Lasso in the very last episode. I'm not giving anything away if anybody's not watched it, but he talks about how he says one of the things he's learned is that air conditioning is a privilege and not a right. So we don't usually have air conditioning. We were just both at the end of our rope, really. It wasn't a time to be modelling AAC and talking about it being hot. It was just a time to get everybody calm, regulated, and happy with something. Mona Delahouque, she talks about safety. So from the moment we are born, humans are on a quest to feel safe, a quest hardwired into our basic physiology. So that physiological safety is really important. And she talks about what's called the polyvagal theory. I'd like to thank the person who did a Creative Commons version of polyvagal theory in line drawings, so I could show you. I can only tell you a little bit about this. It's a massive topic. Mona Delahooke writes about it really well. There are YouTube videos and things you can look at. But she talks about kind of pretty much three kind of neurological states we can be in. Either green, feeling safe, open to social engagement and play. Mobilized. So this is, we might have heard of things called fight or flight. That's, we're ready for a perceived threat. Or we might be immobilized. So in response to an extreme threat. So just shut down, unable to move. I wanted to show you, I was trying to scribble down how I thought this played out sometimes in our life. And I decided, well, I did some scribbling on a piece of paper and I thought, oh, I'd been playing around with Procreate app. So I decided to have a go at making a little cartoon. So here you go. I'm going to play it and then tell you about it. It's not very long. I don't know whether you can work out what's happening here. But at the start, so the start is like the top left-hand corner. We're both green. We're feeling safe. We're playing or something. We're regulated. And then imagine this: Lucy sneezes. Now, because Lucy sneezed, if we look at the next picture, if you follow the arrows, I'm going, ah, and I'm immediately in the red zone. Because so many times a simple childhood illness has landed us in hospital. So already I'm mobilized. I'm ready to get busy. I'm ready to fight. So I'm ready to fight and I'm trying to sort things out for Lucy and I'm trying to help. But then she's realized that she's not feeling too great either. And initially, she's also mobilized. And then in this scenario, we end up in an ambulance going to the hospital. By this point, Lucy's got really poorly. This is purple. It wasn't meant to be purple. I drew it the wrong colour and then drew over it. So she's actually now immobilized, really. She's really unwell. She's no longer in fight or flight, but I still am. Eventually we get home. She may be still immobilized. And then she might be starting to feel better, getting back into the green zone. But by then I am blue. And I'm in the blue zone then for, it can be a week or so afterwards, because the whole thing was just exhausting. So if we just think about what, for families who are going through that cycle all the time, and given that really for really good AAC support and taking on something new, we need to be in the green zone, you can see how just living this life impacts massively our ability to do the work of AAC, and that it's not just about finding problem solving, the practical side of things. It's about caring for the whole family. I have the benefit of tools that might help me get onto the green pathway, but for Lucy, she needs whoever is around her to help her. And also she's at these points, and still really, she's what Mona Delahooke would call a bottom-up processor. She's not processing the world in terms of language really yet. She's very much an emergent communicator. She uses some language in the here and now. So next, apparently, I have a blank slide. I don't know why I had 4 blank slides there, where they came from. I'm sure they weren't meant to have anything on them. So in her first book, Beyond Behaviours, Mona Delahooke talks about how we as adults, parents, caregivers and professionals are the most important tools in the toolbox. And I would just really invite therapists to think, are you seeing parents as agents of AAC implementation, or are you seeing the family as a whole and looking at what they need? I'll whiz through this. As I touched on earlier, I wonder whether actually one of the things we can be really working with as therapists, that we can be working with families with, is observing some of those cues, observing their own cues as to what they need. So on that hot day a couple of weeks ago, Lucy was really, really upset. She was obviously in the red zone around how hot she was feeling and hot and bothered. And so was I, but I needed to take a step back. And I needed to take a moment to be calm so I could get green, so that I could make a decision that helped us. What I eventually decided was, well, I'm going to see if she'll relax if she just gets into bed. And actually, she fell asleep at 6:15 and didn't wake up until 8:15 the next day. But I think if I hadn't taken a step back, in the past, I've made the mistake of trying to model language when I'm choosing the blue or the red zone, thinking, well, I'm going to teach you what this, teach you the word angry, teach you the word frustrated, teach you the word uncomfortable, but it doesn't work because she's not in the right space. And also doing that, if it's not working, I then feel bad about it. And that does not help me back into the green zone either. Okay. I was going to ask for feedback here in the interest of getting through the slides and moving through. I'm probably not going to. Oh, the photo. Jackie, yes, you mentioned the photo. I am going to go back to that, actually. I love this picture. Isn't it great? So that all the black and white pictures on this presentation were taken by a photographer called Jacob Lowe when Lucy and I went to the an AAC information day in Leeds that was run by Communication Matters, which is the UK branch of AAC. And I just think he's captured things beautifully. It was meant to be individual portraits of each of us, but the one with both of us on, that was just me trying to get Lucy to look at the camera. And then this picture, she just looks so proud. But actually, the reason I've put this to illustrate observation as a supportive tool is that what I know about this posture for Lucy is that she's looking. So she's got CVI, and this is her best field of vision. So I know that she's looking up, and she was checking out that photographer and wondering what he was going to do. But when I saw it in the exhibition, I thought, actually, that also speaks of like pride and confidence, and I loved it. Okay. I would suggest maybe thinking of, for yourselves, especially parents, but therapists as well and other professionals, what are the things that, some of the things that you know put you in the red or blue zones, and what puts you in the green zone, even if it's just enough time to make a decision. And also, how can you keep your child safe while you regulate? So sometimes if Lucy's really upset about something or other and I'm not sure what, then I'm getting upset about her being upset about something or other. Her AAC skills aren't such at the minute that she can tell me. She is very emergent. I might just hoist her into bed, give her a load of toys, let her just have a roll around and be comfortable in her own space, and I will just take a bit of time out. And sometimes I don't do that. And when I don't do that, things don't go so well. Okay. So I talked about spaces for everything else, spaces for safety and being in the green zone, being in that safe zone. I also want to talk about spaces to belong. So I've recently come across quite a bit of work on belonging for people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. Lucy does have very significant learning disabilities. When you look at like the DSM criteria, I'm not sure whether she does meet the criteria for PMLD or whether it's more like intellectual disability, or it kind of doesn't matter. But this idea of belonging, I really like, and I like it a lot more than inclusion, because I think it focuses on the experience of belonging and being included rather than just the practice of it. So I think you can look at a space and maybe think, well, that's an inclusive space. It's got a suitable toilet, it's got ramps, it's got communication access. But if the experience of the person in that space isn't that they belong, then it hasn't really achieved what it needs to. So Lucy's a really, really quite skilled non-verbal communicator, and I like to think, quite a skilled reader of her intentional and non-intentional cues. I think this is an excellent thing. It helps her to support her to feel understood, to belong in the relationship with me, that we connect without it being a learning experience or her needing to learn anything new. And that keeps us both in the green zone. And it also does that when Lucy interacts with other people. So Lucy attends a local special school. It's the best school for her at the moment, and it's local enough that she can be involved in other activities in the mainstream. She has lots of rich and varied community opportunities, and I'm just going to tell you about a few of these. I should feel like I want to use a laser pointer, but I don't really know how. So again, I'm going to go as if we're reading this slide. So the top left is Lucy and I and my husband and his family at a rugby league match. Baseball's not my usual sport, it's the rugby league. So I've put that there because actually that being involved in a sporting community and having that, I love the feeling of belonging at a sports venue, and Lucy gets to experience that. The next picture is an AAC get together. We're involved in a charity called One Voice, who are building opportunities for AAC users to get together. This lady she's talking to is Beth Mullen, who is a brilliant woman speaking about AAC. Look her up. But she's trying to encourage Lucy to look at the camera. Lucy's just, as you can see, you can only just make her out because of the device, but she's just looking at Beth. That's all she's interested in, really. Here we've got a picture of Lucy at Brownies with one of her Brownie leaders. Again, you can see the devices there, but you can also see how maybe that there's a physical space thing there in terms of the device being in front of her. And think about being at Brownies. Some of the Brownies are only the height of Lucy in a wheelchair. There's this kind of tray and things. So in some ways, that I think the way Lucy's AAC needs to be set up creates a bit of a physical barrier to belonging in some contexts. Moving on to the bottom row, this is us at Parkrun. I know there are some parkruns in the US. I know a lot of you are in the US, but it's like a 5K free run that happens every Saturday morning. It's quite a big deal here in the UK. So I sometimes push Lucy around Parkrun. Sometimes if she's really lucky, somebody faster than me pushes her around Parkrun and that she gets to get a personal best. The next picture is Lucy with one of her pals, and he's actually modelling on her AAC device because he's just been used to Lucy and having AAC all the time. But here he is, much younger, when Lucy and his big brother and he are sat just reading a book together on the sofa. And actually, if you look at that picture, no one can doubt that communication is happening, that support is happening. Look how Lucy's just like holding Edward's hand. That connection is happening and that is beneficial with or without AAC. And this last picture is her in school. And she's doing a different activity along with her classmates and doesn't have her AAC. One of the things that I have recognised is that in order to implement AAC consistently all the time, it's a big load of advocacy work. People want to ask questions about it, or they don't want to ask questions about it, or they look nervous, and I have to do the work of kind of helping them through that. So I really love the presentations earlier in the conference that were talking about community building and building community skill, because I think if as therapists you can be doing some of that work, that does take some pressure off parents. I wanted to talk a little bit about some work though that's been done around belonging. And this piece of research that by a researcher in the UK called Ben Simmons, who has looked at children's communication and sense of belonging in a special school and in a mainstream school. And what he found was that actually it wasn't to do with the setting or the school, it was more to do with the culture that was whether or not a child experienced belonging, and that belonging looked like different things. And so that really has got me thinking that sometimes having a device, having a AAC, having that structured time and opportunities for that do facilitate belonging, but sometimes the right way for Lucy to experience and belong in an experience might not involve AAC. This is my brother-in-law Tom and Lucy, and they're sat on the sofa. He's playing guitar. You can see that they're looking at each other, that they're connecting, they're having a wonderful shared experience and a sense of belonging together. That might not have much added to it, really, in terms of Lucy's experience and her feeling of herself. On the other hand, I do know that Tom is a great modeler when the AAC is available, and he's kind of taken quite naturally to it. So it's not necessarily just about the skill of the person, it might be about the context and what fits for whatever's happening at that minute. Okay. And I don't know if people are familiar with Brené Brown. You might know her as the TED vulnerability lady. She's a very, very famous TED talk. But she, in her book Atlas of the Heart, talks about true belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. And I know within the AAC community, we talk about how belonging, how modeling doesn't have to, we don't have to demand communication, that we can model, that we can join in and connect and all those things. But I do think there are times where Lucy's belonging is enhanced without AAC. And that might be when a communication partner actually interacts much more naturally with her, just using eye contact or singing a song and picks up on her nonverbal cues. And I find that particularly with family members who maybe aren't as confident with the technology or with the AAC, but she just still loves spending time with them. They have ways of interacting with each other that work brilliantly. And I don't really feel the need to try and get AAC to infiltrate that situation until Lucy brings it in. In fact, last week she got to bring home Brownie Bear from Brownies because somebody, it was me, hadn't charged her device. So she went to Brownies without it, with a few, we had some low-tech cards there. But the Brownie leaders observed how Lucy's interaction with the Brownies was different, and that some of them were a lot more confident in interacting with her because they weren't having to worry about the AAC. And even among a group full of AAC users, she didn't really use her AAC that much, other than to kind of, she liked looking at other people's, and I think she appreciated that there were people there who also had it, but she didn't really use it. So there's belonging, connection, and belonging in wider communities, and I think there is space for that to happen without us having to push to have AAC infiltrating every single moment. So to link to the theme of the conference, I was thinking maybe you could reflect on what it is that one person can do in terms of changing the conversation about spaces. So it might be as an SLP that you reflect on how you deliver advice and how you manage situations where parents maybe aren't picking up on advice. I think we sometimes have a tendency to go, well, they're not managing to do it, so we need to go and help them to problem solve. And my question would be maybe, well, whose problem are you solving? Is it yours or is it theirs? But I think there are lots of things that we can do to just build connection and be okay about AAC not happening all the time. And I really, really want any parents listening to go away with that, because you are creating belonging. You are creating safe spaces, and you are doing everything else that you need to do. So lift the guilt Okay. Because it's not just that you're doing those things and they're taking up time for AAC. They're all critical in their own right. So again, that's the links to the references and information if you want them. I use Slidesmania slides, so I have to do the obligatory, this is where I got it from. And are there any questions? If you want to send me questions or comments afterwards, there's mummyversusaac.blog, which is the blog that I write, and I'm at mummyversusaac on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And that's all. Any comments or questions?
Thank you so much, Joanna. That was, for me personally, very enlightening, and I hope for a lot of other people, I'm sure it was as well.
So too.
Thank you so much. There are a lot of just great comments in the Slack. I would encourage you to go and look at. I think you impacted a lot of people. I don't see any questions at this time. Is there anything else you would like to share before we end?
Anything else I would like to share?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I think it's bedtime.
All right.
Well,
thank you, everyone.
I'm sorry to the people who are presenting at 11 o'clock over here. I think I'm going to have to catch up with them later.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.